Good morning, everyone. In this share, I'd like to deal with a subject that is somewhat connected to what we discussed the previous week, which is when we discussed the concept of bringing instruments, bringing music, etc., into a shul, and the history behind that contentious question. So this will be a bit of a continuation in the sense that the question now is, to what extent can you use space inside of a shul for, meaning specifically the place where you daven, for events generally, events that are not connected to davening and learning per se. This is relevant to Batei Chabad, where often you have additional events, cultural events, which might even be fairly secular when you look at that event specifically. But the concept is that it's supposed to contribute to a sense of community. It's supposed to draw people in, to sort of lead them to join the more religious aspects, more religious programming that the shul offers. Usually the opposite. They usually have they come out officially for whatever events and also for the shul. Right, or sometimes almost the other way around, depending on how much of a need there is to build the community. But so Beis Chabad will often be hosting and holding all kinds of interesting events. Sometimes in the shul itself, depending on how the Beis Chabad is built. So the question is, what is the permissibility of that? We also have questions like that here as well. You often have a shul that is used as a place, as a space for community, for events. Often this shul, stands to get some income from that. So that's the question that's relevant both in Batei Chabad and back home as well. I should point out before we jump into it that the din can change if it's mamish, a temporary space for a minyan, or you're renting the place from someone else, or mamish belongs to an individual, it's his own private minyan, or if it was mamish made lechatchila, that it's going to be both for this and for that. So there are other factors that can possibly influence this question. But the main question here is, you have a real shul. It was built to be a shul, which maybe isn't so common here in this neighborhood, but it's common in other neighborhoods and in other localities, and Batei Chabad as well. Often they build a big, beautiful shul. It's clearly meant to be the space for davening. There's an aron, there's a bima, there's benches, pews. It's clearly very, very, specifically designed around being a shul. And still, you want to use that space for whether it's a unique presentation or a musical event. So we're going to deal with the main halachic issues involved in that type of question. So in addition to last week's shiur, which both will actually see also the general question of music in the shul, we'll come back, we'll circle back to that, so to speak, in this shiur as well a bit. Also the tshuva that I cited at the end of last year from the Igros Moshe to my grandfather was in reference to essentially holding events in a shul. They used to have events with mixed dancing, couples. That was considered the entertainment, and that was the question about doing that in a shul. But we'll also see that this ties into other subjects, other shiurim that we've done here. We'll see that it ties into a number of them, as we shall see. So the main we'll find out. So the main thrust, the main crux of the shiur here is from the Shalos Shuvas Sridei Eish. Sridei Eish is Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg. He lived from 1884 to 1966. He was a Rav and a Paisik, but a very interesting personality. He originally was from Russia. He learned in Litvish yeshivas, but from then he somehow ended up in an entirely different milieu. He ended up in Germany and joined the Orthodox rabbinical world in Germany, which is a bit of a different kind of place. During the Holocaust, he ended up back in Lithuania and in Poland. He survived, and after the war, he ended up in his next Gilgal, he ended up in Switzerland, and he created some kind of, I'm not sure to what extent, how many people were actually around him, but he created some kind of minor position for himself, his own little niche in Switzerland, and that's where he was till he passed away. He never married, among other interesting aspects of his life. And Bechlal, he was a bit of a Kalayim, a bit of a mix of Lithuania and Germany. And he had all kinds of interesting opinions and things to say. My impression is that, to a certain extent, he's still acknowledged and respected in the mainstream, so to speak, world of Torah and yeshivas, but maybe up to a certain point. Once it gets to his more interesting things, then maybe they draw the line there. At any rate, he has among his works, his main work perhaps is the Shalos HaShuvah Sri Deyesh, where there are many relevant and the Shuvas are dealing with current shilas, current issues, and it's written in his unique style. So we're going to go through now Barichas through a Shuvah and Sri Deyesh because he really brings most or all of the issues involved here. So the title of the Shuvah is Hartzaot Chulin V'Koncertim B'Veis HaKnesses, to have just secular lectures and concerts in a shul.
What does it say Shulchan Aruch?
We're going to get to Shulchan Aruch. We're going to go right through it. So he says, I wrote this Shuvah. This Shuvah was actually written, he says, in a very interesting context. This was written in Germany in the 30s, once the Nazis came to power, but before World War II, before the Holocaust started. So there were a lot of restrictions being placed on Jewish life, Jewish communal life. He says they were captured, they were under Rosh, Hamaturaf, Hamanuvi, Machshmai V'Zichrai, and they were all being trampled by his henchmen. And among the other terrible gzeiros, German Jews were not allowed to gather in public spaces outside the shul. So that led to this question. She says, besides the historical value of the Shaila and Shuvah, there's a lot of benefit, Pasha, to going through these halachas, because we have many kehillas nowadays as well, where it seems like the only place you could actually try to gather a group of Jews would be in a shul. She says, even though this is a pretty lengthy Shuvah, he says, I've deliberately omitted the real pilpul part, and you'll also notice he says that I use a lot of Sifrei Yishayim that were discovered recently, as we shall see, the Ravya, the Arzurah, which we mentioned in the previous Shiur, which were all printed in the last 150 years. So they also play a role in this Shuvah regarding the status of a Beis Knesset as well. And he emphasizes that these are Svarim at the G'dayli Achrein and the Magen Avraham, the Mishnah Bruda, as we shall see, did not have. And once we have those Makaitis, it can have an impact on how we understand certain dinim without having to resort to a deichik. So now to get into the Shaila and the Shuvah, so he says, the question is, can you have secular speeches, lectures in a shul, and can you do concerts? So whoever he's writing to, he doesn't include the specific names and places, but whoever it was said that now it's a shas at chak, because the Yidden are under real pressure, under real pain. They've been pushed out, they're expelled from any other space. And Bechlal, they're being persecuted, and it would be a great mitzvah to have some kind of event to cheer them up. And there's also the concern that there are also the more liberal, the more reformed synagogues that have their own cultural events, and if we're not offering an alternative, so they might be attracted to go to there, and then who knows what else or other influences can come along with that. So he starts off by quoting the Taz. So the Siman Shulchan Aruch, it's directly relevant to this question, is Siman Kuf and Aleph, where it discusses the things you are allowed and not allowed to do in shul. So he starts by quoting the Taz. The Taz says that he thinks that the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to eat in a shul. Taz says, I believe that Orchim are allowed to eat in a shul, because we see this in Hilchos Shabbos, that it comes up. You have the Orchim eating in the shul and making kiddush and this and that, all those halachas. And why? So the Sri Deyesh says, why would that be allowed? So we would say that it's a bit of a tchak. They have nowhere else to eat. And you can't say it's a mitzvah, because it's only a mitzvah for a machnes oirech to feed archim. It's not a mitzvah for the oirech to eat. And the archim are the ones eating. So it's not the mitzvah here, it's the tchak. So he wants to say, let's compare this to the Taz. This is also a Shas Chak. In that case, they have nowhere to eat. In this case, they have nowhere to hold an event. So that would be the Svara, seemingly straightforward to be mater. However, this Taz is far from Pashut, far from simple. He says the Achreinim disagree with the Taz, and they say that this really is a fundamental chlekes in the whole gather of a shul. Can you make a Tanai in a shul or not? Because a shul is not meant for other things. The question is whether you can make some kind of Tanai condition and say, look, we've agreed that we're also going to use the shul for other purposes. So it turns out that the Ramban holds that you're allowed. There's a Gemara. The Gemara mentions Bate Knesset Shel Bavel Al Tanaihim Asuyim, but the question is, what does that mean practically? So the Ramban cited in the Ran and Megillah, so connection to Maseches Megillah, says that Taka, this is something we can apply across the board. We can make a Tanai. Masha'enke in Taisvis and the Rosh and the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch all essentially hold that the Tanai only works b'churbanai. Once the Beis Knesset is destroyed, then the Tanai can kick in and then you can use it for other things. But when it's b'yeshuvah, when the shul is still standing, they hold the Shitun Yishayim and Achreinim. There is no such thing as a Tanai. So they would disagree with the Taz. The Taz's whole word is built on a Tanai, and the Tanai heter is not so pashut, not so ungenommen. Also, you have the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram there holds that maybe the Tanai does work b'yeshuvah, but only in Bavel. Only in Bavel you're able to make a Tanai. Nowadays, you can't make a Tanai according to the Magen Avram. So if you're not just going to... Why Bavel? I don't think Magen Avram really says, but the Gemara says Bavel and garnished. I don't know. So if that's what you say, so then is there really Tanai? Is there really a heter? Can we really rely on the Taz? Can we go with the Taz against all these other opinions? However, he says the later Paiskim, the Birkei Yosef, the Mishnah Brura, and others, they still say that with all that taken into account, b'shas hatchak, if it's a real tight spot, you are allowed to feed aniyim in our shuls. So if that's where we're going with la halacha, so we are relying apparently on the shita of the Tanai. So then benidin didan. Again, and the Mishnah Brura said it's a tchak and a tzorech mitzvah. That was what the Mishnah Brura tiny, that it's considered a tzorech mitzvah. So, but in the dam, we could also say it's a shas tchak and it's a tzorech mitzvah. What's the mitzvah here? To encourage Yidden, to cheer Yidden up is also, this is what they are aniyim to. They're lacking this. We know that if everyone's really depressed and deflated, that's not a good state to be in. And we have to mechazik people and encourage them. And the lectures could be to give them chizuk about history, of how Jews stood up to other challenges and made a meiser nefesh, kiddush Hashem. And again, we have also the question of whether they'll be attracted to other synagogues and hear other messages. So it should be considered a tzorech mitzvah, just like feeding aniyim in the shul. So can we still stick with this heter of the Tanai, of the Taz, and the Mishnah Brura, la halacha, that you are allowed to feed aniyim? Then he says maybe you can say that it was only a heter for guests from other cities, because that's what it's mashma in some of the Makairis, that dafka someone from out of town, that's the tchak, he has nowhere to go, but here people live here. But he says no. If you look in the Rishonim, the vart is that it's not for the aniyim, it's a tchak. For the anshe eir, they can live, they can eat in their house. So that's the gabi achil u'shtia. For achil u'shtia, if you live in the city, you can eat in your house. If you don't live in the city, you have a tchak, you need the shul. But in this case, if we truly believe in the value of these events, the only way to hold them is together. They can't do it in their house. So in that sense, they're like aniyim, the gabe this inyan, that you need to do it in the shul. In Shulchan Aruch it says another din, that you're not allowed to do cheshbainis, you're not allowed to use the space of a shul to just go through your numbers, do your calculations and things like that. And it's mashma even things that have value to the public. Zriya v'cheshbainis shel rabbim, it says in Shulchan Aruch. And the Bir Allah and the Mishnah Brura says b'shem the Ramban that even though the people, the city Taka need this cheshbainis to be made and they have nowhere else to gather, the Ramban says, but it's kalos rosh. there's a musik of kalas Rosh, that you're not treating the shul with respect, with the seriousness. So even if it's a tzedek rabim, apparently you're not supposed to be doing things that have kalas Rosh. But the Siddur says, let's analyze, let's break it down. There's three categories here. There's minor kalas Rosh, that would be like eating and drinking. So that would only be allowed where you have a Tanai, and depending on how you hold the Tanai works or where it works. So according to the Magen Avraham, you wouldn't be allowed to do even that level of kalas Rosh, because according to Magen Avraham, you can't make a Tanai now. Then you have major kalas Rosh, that would be like cheshbonis and other and entertainment. So that would be usher even with a Tanai. A Tanai doesn't fix everything. You can't just do whatever you want. And then there's a third category. It says of things that are not kalas Rosh. It's just mundane. It's just weekday activities. So you'd like to argue that everyone would agree that a Tanai would work for that. That even the Magen Avraham, even the others would hold that for that, it should be okay. And where would these speeches fit in? Where would these events fit in? He wants to argue that it fits in the third category, that it's not even kalas Rosh. So, back to the Tanai should work. It's even better than eating and drinking, which is minor kalas Rosh, and that's where the machlekes is. He says, a speech, at least the speeches he's talking about, there's no kalas Rosh involved. It's a serious event. People are being respectful. Eating is less respectful. However, this is a new question. This is still based on the concept of a Tanai. He's saying that if you have a Tanai, if it's for eating, that's more debatable. But for Tashmish Chayil, that should be fine. But there's another issue, because the Magen Avraham is also machmir that there has to be a Tanai made explicitly. But the stomach, if it's just a show and all of a sudden we want to do things there, you can't make a Tanai. You can't say there was a Tanai. Others disagree with the Magen Avraham, but Siddur is being very careful here, at least at this point, and he's been chayshish to all the major shittas. But he says, B'emes, and this is where his first makar from Yishayim comes in, that he's excited about. If he says, you look in the Zerua, in the Megillah, and the Beis HaKnesses, he says that all the things that it says that it's also to do in a Beis HaKnesses Shel Eretz Yisrael, they're all mutter in a Beis HaKnesses Shel Bavel. And therefore he says, Hilchach mutter lacha v'lishtay so'idna b'vate knisiyas b'vate midrash shalonu dal t'nai hein asuyin. So there is clearly we're allowed to eat and drink b'chlal in our shuls because they're all made al t'nai. And he adds, Zechurani, I remember that when I was in Ashpira, where the name Shapiro comes from, etc. So I was in the house of Mereinu Reb Simcha of Shapira. So we ate in the Beis Medrash. And he told us that he saw that Rabbi Yehuda Meshmira ate in the Beis Medrash. He says, however, I believe that it was on Shabbos. So, as we shall discuss, also from the Nesa Kalim later, that Shabbos is a higher level. Shabbos can be considered a Sudas mitzvah, so there wouldn't be a raya for a regular Suda during the week. But Miyukachi, whether or not my story is perfectly relevant and applicable, I'm telling you a fact. The Erzurua says, Bizman Hazeh, you're allowed to eat in our Bate Knesiyas and our Bate Midrashas, even if you're not a Talmud Chacham, because as we shall see, if you're a Talmud Chacham, then it's Mutter B'deichek, but if you're not a Talmud Chacham, you're not. But he's saying that this Tanai is across the board, for everyone, the Tanai really works, according to the Erzurua. We discussed this last time. It's around 1200. It's pretty early. So the Magen Avraham didn't see this Erzurua, however, because the Erzurua had not been printed yet. This is one of the major works of Yishayim that had been hidden for many centuries. And he only saw in secondary sources Bekitzer Gadol. And he says, I have in my big kuntras, right? Because he said he omitted the pilpul in his shuvah. So I have a big kuntras on this, which I don't know for where it ended up. But my big kuntras, I have brought big rayas that takas the Tanai should work even b'stam. Even though l'maisa, I don't want to come out officially on the record the halacha as a psak to disagree with the Magen Avraham who said it doesn't work b'stam. But we can compare this to the aniyim that were matter in our shul. And even though, according to the Magen Avraham, it shouldn't be okay, but we're matter because it's tzarech mitzvah, like the Mishnah Berurah said. So again, he wants to revert to that taina that we can at least treat these as equal to the eating and drinking that even the Mishnah Berurah is not. That's part one. Part two, he says, if we're really working here based on the concept of a Tanai, he says there's also grounds to be doubtful and say that that's all in shows, he says, in the lands of the East, Ba'artzos HaMizrach, or maybe even in Ashkenaz, but in previous generations. So because it's so common, because it's so widespread that the shul is used for eating for different functions for the aniyim, so you could say that because it's so common and widespread, that it's Ke'ilu they made a Tanai. In other words, why would you say that there's a Tanai without making a Tanai? It must be something that's so embedded in the culture, it's so culturally obvious that you don't have to spell it out. However, where I am in Germany here, the shuls were all very proper and upright, and no one had been eating in a shul for a long time. So he's doubtful as to whether he can be matir. The only reason, why we're even having this discussion is because of this gzeira. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these events in the shul now either, if not for the gzeira that was, foisted on us from, beyond our control. So maybe we can't say that there's really a Tanai here, because this situation just started, just began. And when we built our shuls, we never anticipated, we never imagined that events could take such a horrible turn. So maybe there's no hatter. I already said that it's tzarech mitzvah, it's mutter, even where Tanai shouldn't work, because the Mishnah Berurah said that it works. And even though according to the Tosfos and the Rosh, the Tanai shouldn't work, according to Magen Avraham, the Tanai shouldn't work for that reason, or because there's, bestama. But we said already that we paskin, the paskin before me already paskin that the tzarech mitzvah, it's okay, and this is a tzarech mitzvah. However, the Mishnah Berurah, ultimately, when he was matir, part of his heter was relying on the shittas, like the Erzerua, that say that a Tanai does work. So even though maybe Stamazah, we wouldn't want to just rely on those, but because of the situation with Aniyim and this and that, so we are ultimately relying in part on the shittas that say that a Tanai works. And assuming that a Tanai works bastam. But if, as he suggested, it's hard to say that there's a Tanai in these shuls in Germany, so if it's just a tzarech mitzvah without the shittas of a Tanai, who says the Mishnah Berurah would be matir? So until now, this has all been working with a Tanai, and now he's going to move on to other heterim that are more mefurish and Chazal and Shulchan Aruch, even without a Tanai. That's really the rest. As I'll mention at the end, obviously, that was a unique question to Germany. He was saying that, there's a problem with German shuls where it's been completely out of practice to do such a thing. But ultimately, the mainstream psak today that most shuls I assume rely on is that the Tanai does work in our shuls, and therefore not just Sudas Mitzvah, but even Sudas Cholin should be okay, as long as you don't reach the higher level of Kalas Resh, presumably. So anyway, moving on to the other Tatum without a Tanai. So he says, Ve'ein loymar. You can't say that b'makom mitzvah achila shtia would be allowed. And he says, for example, in Sif Dalet it says, l'tzorech mitzvah, if you're gathering to be ma'aber the shana, to deal with the calendar, which used to be a gathering, an annual gathering, or more often. So when they gathered in the shul, you're allowed to eat. This comes from Chazal. So maybe you would argue that dafka being ma'aber the year is a mitzvah gemura, so the suda that comes along with it is also allowed. Mashenkin here, where the whole there's no true mitzvah here. That's the premise here. And also over there, the Talmidei Chachamim that are being ma'aber the year, and we know that Talmidei Chachamim Bechlal are allowed to eat in the shul. Why does it mention that it's the tzarech mitzvah of the Ibur if Talmidei Chachamim are allowed to eat in the shul? He says no, because a Talmid Chacham is only allowed to eat in the shul b'chlal b'doichik. Tzarech mitzvah le'ibur shana. It seems like we're saying you're allowed to eat even shaloi medoichik. But if you're not a Talmid Chacham, according to Din of the Shulchan Aruch, would not be allowed to eat and drink even with tzarech mitzvah. There's, you have a number of Rishonim that point out, you have the Gemara and Pesachim talking about making Kiddush and Shul. These, like I mentioned earlier, you have these halachas and Shabbos about making Kiddush and Shul for the guests. The guests are eating and sleeping. And they say, because Suda Shabbos is a Suda mitzvah. So it could be that the Afka Suda Shabbos, only Suda Shabbos, we're talking the eating itself is a mitzvah, and that wouldn't be considered Kalas Rosh, because you're mamish doing another mitzvah in Shul. But the Suda for Ibur Shana, where the eating itself is not a mitzvah, it's just helping you do the other mitzvah of Ibur. So maybe it would only be mutter for a Talmud Chacham involved, but not for anyone else. So in this case, where it's only Soirech mitzvah, it's helping, there's some ultimate mitzvah we feel over here, it's helping Yidden out in a certain way, but we wouldn't be matter that based on the other Tatum for being, for Ibur Shana, which is for Tamid Chachamim, or for Suda Shabbos, which is a Suda mitzvah. But again, he goes back to the Svar that I mentioned before. Ultimately, Achila has more Kalas Rosh. So maybe that's why you have only Tamid Chachamim Medaychik, or only a Suda mitzvah, or things like that. But if it's just Hashmishay Chayil, like an event that we want to hold here, so then, I've argued the Suda says that this is not Kalas Rosh. So then maybe Mamash L'Chatchila, you should be allowed to do it. And he says that you can bring a raya to this, that the Ramah said that when he said that the Talmid Chacham could only eat Medaychak, it's only in a Beis HaKnesses. But a Beis HaMedrash, it's even Shalei Medaychak. And they asked why, or the other way around, why is it mutter by Beis HaKnesses Medaychak? The Ran was the Makar only said that it's mutter by Beis HaMedrash. She never said anything about a Beis HaKnesses. Where does this whole halacha of eating Medaychak in a Beis HaKnesses come from? He says, Hagufa, Yeshleima, that eating midaychak is not Kalas Rosh. Sitting down to have a meal, that's Kalas Rosh. But grabbing a bite while you're learning, that's not even Kalas Rosh. So it's just Tashmish Chayil. And since it's a sort of mitzvah, it's helping you learn. You don't want to interrupt and have to leave to go have a meal. You just want to grab a bite while you're learning. So even though the Chil itself is not a mitzvah, but the tzarech mitzvah, Tashmish Chayil is mutter, so that would also be the case, according to his logic, for these events. So that's an argument he wants to make. Now to the third part. Another argument he wants to make. That there's also a concept of tzarchei rabim. It says in Gemara Shabbos that you're allowed to go to shul, beis medrash, lefakeach al iskei rabim b'Shabbos. So there's the Shabbos element here, and there's the shul element. You're allowed to take care of iskei rabim. Now she says it's little shus, so it's not mamish mitzvah, but it's important. It's a major communal need. So we see here that Medina de Gemara, tzarchei rabim is allowed in the shul. And this is a gathering. You're gathering in the shul for tzarchei rabim. So maybe we can fit this into that category as well. And he says you can't action and insist that there's pikuach nefesh. There's no. If there was pikuach nefesh, then that would be for sure mutter. You wouldn't need a special halacha to tell you that. So it must mean that it's not pikuach nefesh. It's just tzarchei rabim. He says a die, and there's still room to mechalik and say that when you're taking care of the community, that is itself, in a sense, a certain kind of mitzvah. Masha Enkein, having a speech, you're not taking care, you're not solving a specific issue, you're not gathering to solve it. On some level, obviously, he holds that you are solving an unspoken problem, which is that people need to come together. But at least for the sake of argument, he wants to make a bimachalik. So that's where he leaves it. But ultimately, I believe he ultimately does really believe that it is tzarech rabim or tzarech mitzvah. But just for the sake of argument, he's trying to argue whether it is or is not comparable.
Why is speech called the only film? Speech normally is like
Well, it depends. If it's a shiur and halacha, then there wouldn't be any question. That obviously belongs to the beis medrash. But if we're talking about, I don't know, someone comes and, this was before the Holocaust, so let's say today you just bring a Holocaust survivor to give a speech. Okay, it's It's inspirational, but it's not really, there's no Torah necessarily being mentioned. And that's what he was talking about. We're going to talk about history of, whatever was inspirational before the Holocaust. No, he says we're going to talk about the tzaras that we had them all and how people were Meisei Nefesh, Al Kiddush Hashem. They're going to talk about those types of things. Yeah. Another halacha he wants to compare it to. There's also a halacha in Gemara and in halacha that you're allowed to do a hesped. A certain hesped though. The question is, what kind of hesped? You can argue that it's only a hesped for someone who's mamash a big chacham. And it's a shtickle dvar mitzvah, like we see, like there's also cheshbonish shal mitzvah you're allowed to do in shul. And he goes to different Makairis, and a lot of Makairis, including Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Avela, says that Dafka Talmidei Chachamim and their family, but not regular people. So it sounds like it's because of Kavod HaTorah, but the Stamazoi, a public gathering to give a hesped, a shleishim, etc., like we have today, that might not be okay according to this din of Chazal and Shulchan Aruch. He says, really, if you look in Rishonim, he argues the real chiluk between the Talmid Chacham and everyone else is not that he's a Talmid Chacham. The word is that it's a public event. When a private person passes away, so it's a private event, it's a family event. Who else is showing up? But when it's a hesped of a Chacham, everyone has to show respect, pay the respects to the Chacham. So everyone comes, so it's a Tzorech Rabim, so that's why it's mutter. So if you look at Rabbi Yerucham, that's what it says. Maspidim behem hesped shel rabim. Kolemar hesped sheboim sham rabim b'pnei kvoid hames and b'pnei adam gadol she'em sham. But the emphasis and the way he frames it is that it's for the rabim. So it's mashma that when we keep on mentioning an adam gadol, it's just a metzias. Usually it's an adam gadol, but for some reason it wasn't an adam gadol, but still there was public interest. It should still be okay. It's tzarchit tzibur. That's the real logic here. Says, and this is where he starts quoting some more contemporary sources, as I saw in the Shalos Shuvas, Imrei Eish, who tries to argue the opposite. Who's the Imrei Eish? The Imrei Eish is the Maharam Ash. Who's the Maharam Ash? So his full name is Remeir Eisenstatter. So the Maharam is Remeir, and the Eisenstadt gets shortened to Ash, and he's mainly known like that. So he was one of the Chashav Rabbanim in Hungary, and the context of this, and other shuvas will mention, is the big controversy they had regarding doing a chuppah in shul, because that was something that reform or people leaning to more modern ways of doing things wanted to do, and for that reason, the Rabbanim had felt some major resistance to that, which they might otherwise not have had to that extent, perhaps. So the Imrei Eish in that context was trying to prove that you can't even do a regular hesped in shul. He wanted to compare the chuppah to that. So he said, if you look at the Shuv of the Rambam, which was printed already then in Pe'er Hadar, so they asked the Rambam, they said, in Sefer Ava you wrote, this is one of the Shuvas referencing the Mishnah Torah, it says, in your Sefer Ava you wrote that you're only allowed to do a hesped shel Rabim. He says, now the minhag in Alexandria is that we bring the mess to the chutzner of the shul until everyone davens, and then the Dayanim and the Chazonim, which probably means the Shamashim, come. And then the whole community comes with the mita, and we say Tziddik Adin, and we do kinnis, whatever kind of sad songs were recited. So is that a hesped shel Rabim? Basically, they made like a standard procedure where they drop the mace off near the shul. Is that shel Rabim? And the Rambam said it's not hesped shel Rabim. Hesped shel Rabim is one of the Gedolei Ha'ir that everyone is mechuyev to be maspid, or you heard that an Adam kosher, someone very special passed away. So the Imrei Eish, the Maharam Ash, cited this tshuva of the Rambam, and he wanted to prove that, so you see, clear, the Rambam seemingly was asked, can it be anyone? And the Rambam said, no, only a Talmid Chacham. However, he says, Maharam Ash himself realized to some extent that in the Gemara it says that the Rafram was masped his daughter-in-law in shul, and he said it's my honor and of the mess that everyone came, and it's mashma from there that it's not lav dafka, it's Kavod HaTorah, which was Yakar Didi Udemesa. So it sounds like it was also just whoever that his daughter-in-law was. She had some some position of respect within the community, and the Gemara seems to imply it's not purely a kavod Torah. He says, anyway, if you look in the Lashon of the Rambam in that Shuvah, you'll see that was not the Rambam's point of Talmid Chacham versus not Talmid Chacham. Now, what the question was that it's like kind of a trick. The shul's already there, people are already coming to daven. Oh, we're going to drop the mace off near the shul, and then everyone's going to be there anyway. So the Rambam says that no. When we talk about a hesped Shraga, it means the kind of hesped where everyone would have come if you announced the hesped is in shul. Everyone would have come because it's of public importance, public interest, which usually would be an Adam Chacham or Adam Kasher. But what you're describing, the Rambam is saying, is you're just dropping off every mess near the shul, and everyone has to participate because they're there, the mess is there, and that's not the kavod of the shul. That's not really a public importance and interest. But even according to the Rambam's logic, you don't have to be an Adam Chacham dafka. Like anyone who is a public persona that people would take a public interest in. The klal would be that whenever Rabbim come, that's all you need. He then quotes another marker that deals with chuppahs, the Yad Shul and Yad Deya and Avelis. The Yad Shul is a Yosef Shul, Nottinson, more famously known for the Shals and Shuvas, Shul Meshiv. So he's touching on the Avelis versus Hesped versus Chuppah, and he wrote that the reason why Hesped Sharabim is mutter. What's the tzedek haram? The tzedek haram is there should be nesayret to tshuva. So that fits into the kedushas Beis HaKnesses. But for other things, not, because the Beis HaKnesses is only for kedusha and tefillah, and that's why he wanted to argue that a chuppah, tarevis, anoshim, v'noshim, mingling, he wanted to argue that would not fit into that category. So even if you accept that a hesped is tzedek haram, but for tshuva. So he says, Bal karchach. It can't just be a psalam d'she hesped. Sometimes the Rosh Hashiva passes away, and you see already since the time of Chazal, but for hundreds of years, you see elaborate espedim that Gedolim made for other Gedolim that are very Torah-dik, almost shtickle Torah, but that's clearly not what the Yad Shul is talking about, because then that's like any other shiur you're giving in a shul. The premise happens to be that someone passed away, but you're giving a Torah shiur. So if he's saying that it's because of the tshuva, Muslim Sgan, that they're standing and crying and they're weeping, we miss him, or whatever it is, that, however you make people weep for a deceased, and it's still mutter because there's still a sense of his eirus tshuva. So we can still fit these speeches into that category. There is this eirus tshuva because the speeches, the lectures he's talking about are about Jewish history, and you're going to know about the greatness of Jews in previous generations, or Gedolei Yisrael and their contributions. Another possible subject that was of interest in Germany was, Chachmei Yisrael that contributed to the sciences or whatever, stuff like that, which he says, incidentally, contributed so much to the nations that they lived in, and yet those nations didn't credit them when things got bad. So, that there's a historical parallel to the time they're living through, because Jews have contributed so much to Germany, and yet Germany turned on them the way it did. So either way, these types of topics, he feels, are also, there's an underlying sense of Eseirus Tshuva. So even the Yad Shul would admit that this is like a Hesped Sharabim. And then he adds another svara. He says there's an opinion of Yishayim that hold that we're talking about it tonight, not tonight, but there's also another concept. The Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, the leaders, the Maimad Anshe Ha'ir, it comes up in Dayanos for those learning it. So when you have the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir in the presence of the Anshe Ha'ir, they can mamish remove the kedusha of the shul. They can be mafkia the kedusha. And there's even apparently Rabbi Hanan teaches that in the Al Tanai. The Al Tanai is that you can always remove the kedusha and put it back. When you have these lectures where everyone is participating, including whoever the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir are, the board of directors of the show, whatever you want to call it. So they might have the power to revoke the kedusha of the show for a bit. That's its own argument, and he's not getting into an extra length here. So that was that point that he made. Now,
what about the issue of income? Because most schools nowadays are They managed to keep alive.
Right, so
he didn't mention anything about income.
Right, so he doesn't mention that. I'm not sure if any major poskim mention that as a factor. It is an interesting question whether that could be a mitigating event. That would also be a tzur charabim in a certain sense, maybe not the event itself, but right. Yeah, but right. You have other shilas. You have other shilas where can they rent it out to yeshiva? The questions we'll see today: can they rent it out to yeshiva? And yeshiva will use part of the space for a dormitory, and part of the question there is, the shul, the expenses are too big, or they overbuilt, and now the space is too big and it's not being used, and they're not bringing money in. So you do see that come up in those contexts.
I remember discussing it in Morristown when we were in yeshiva. The top floor was under construction, and they didn't have enough place for the bathroom, so they wanted to change all the shiur in the room.
Yeah.
And I thought it was in the shul. So they were discussing if they can make the shiur room, I'm sure, to dormitories.
Right. So that's
I don't know if it's the same concept.
Right.
It's not really a shul.
Right. So I'm not getting into that. Sleeping in a shul, over a shul, that's its whole its own discussion. But yeah, you do see discussions like that. I don't know if anyone has discussed this particular, that the shul doubles as a whole and makes its money that way. I don't know but anyways, we're seeing there are a number of, the arguments. First is the Tanai, which he didn't want to rely on so much, but today is relied on more. So then really any achilu shtiya of chulin should be okay. Then you have the other things that he's comparing, that might be more relevant, where there's some kind of tzarech mitzvah, so tzarech rabim or haspish rabim.
You mentioned the Magen Avraham before, then you said only in Baba. Perhaps the logic is that only in Baba we know how to make it tonight. Nowadays we don't know how to make the proper tonight, so it could be that we don't know what is the tonight that you do. Is that you're allowed, that it's not a real shul. So nowadays the kedusha, or basic knesset, doesn't really exist. So therefore you kind of you're putting it in a way that, like, for example, you do certain all the tanaim. For example, you're washing hands.
Yeah.
But you have a tanaim and you want to speak afterwards. It's also brought down in a halacha that you're even allowed to speak to certain things like this. If you have a time, let's say you want to have the head.
Yeah.
It's brought down in a halacha certain things like this. Is that what the tanaim is? What is the tanaim exactly?
It's just you're saying, how does a shul get its kedusha? You build it with that intent. That's we're getting together. We're going to build a shul, and the shul is a mikdash ma'at and a certain kedusha, and it has to be treated a certain way. However, if you say that we're not fully dedicating this space to serve that function, it's also here to serve other functions. So then those two things can coexist with each other.
Is it tonight that we are allowing certain events in the shul, or is it tonight it's not a real basic knesset, and therefore it's called that?
I think you'll find there are shtiklach that discuss this more in the lamdish sense of what exactly is the Tanai, how does the Tanai work in the Kedushas basic knesses and all of that. I wasn't going to get into that directly, but yeah, one way of understanding it would be is that the kedusha here, it's not fully dedicated to this one thing. It's it's partially we're using it just like if you happen to have a minion in your living room. So that moment it has certain milas of a shul, but it's not you're not turning the space into a mikdash ma'at with all that signifies.
Well, what about the comments for a Sefer Torah? Is that also a part of it? You have a bima in front of it.
Right. So I was going to mention later that someone more recently mentioned about covering the aron. So I'll get to that. So the next eitzah that the Siddur mentions is, what about the trick of saying some Torah, saying a kapitel Tehillim or something before the event? Because you have the concept of walking into a shul. The Gemara says you want to call someone from the shul, but you don't walk into a shul for no reason. So you're supposed to go in and say a mishnah, a pasuk. So it sounds like, once you start with Torah, then you can do whatever you want. However, he says in the Mishnah Berurah, it says that if you're going in for the heat, for the rain, you should go somewhere else. Don't use this trick to go in stamazay for protection. And then he says Mishnah Berurah is machalik between whether you have another eitzah or not. whether you have another place to go or not. If you have another place to go, then you should go there. If not, then this trick would work, even if first time you're trying to flee the elements. So there's nowhere else to go. So maybe the Mishnah Berurah would agree that you can also use this method of starting with Taita. If you ask me, though, Sudesh says, I would tell you that the chiluk should be that when you want to call someone, the problem is why you're walking into shul. The whole walking in was the tzedek atzmi. Once you said the pasuk and you went in, the knisa, the entry was okay, so that's fine. But here, where you're not just walking in, you're staying. So even if you say a pasuk and the pasuk allows you to go in, so you got in fine. But then, why are you staying there? You're staying there, or you're eating, or whatever it is. That's not connected to the Torah that you learned. So, Mr. Day says, if you'd ask me, logic would say that should be a tashmish chayil that's not allowed. It's tamur. The Mishnah Berurah doesn't acknowledge this svara. So, according to my svara, Mr. Day says that trick wouldn't work for a lecture, because just because you start off one way doesn't allow you to continue to do something else. But he says, but that's just me. But he says the Rishonim hold otherwise, and here comes another Rishon that was printed in recent generations. The Rav Yah, which the Rav Yah and the Reziru are connected. So the Rav Yah, and also in Maseches Megillah, the part that deals with these halachas, says that you're not allowed to do cheshbonos and go in due to the rain. Elam kain boy lemisni agav garara the boy hilchos atzilusa. So unless you say, look, I need to learn, and you need to have clarity and be relaxed in order to learn, so that's why you're going in, and then you're also being saved from the rain. So that's what the Rav Yah says clearly, that you could do the two together, start with learning and then be saved from the rain. And Mishnah Berurah himself, as we said, did not acknowledge another svara, and the Mishnah Berurah just tried to argue that if you have another place to go, then rain should not be a good enough reason. But Lamaisa, even that is against the Rav Yah. The Rav Yah seemed to be matter across the board. Again, weiter, he says the Mishnah Berurah didn't have the Rav Yah because it was just printed in Tafresh Peivav in 1926 by the Chavra Mekitzei Nedomim, which were Dafka Maskilim. Mekitzei Nedomim actually still exists in some form till today. They print obscure stuff from Goinim, Rishonim. So they were the ones through whom the Rav Yah was printed. It was after Mishnah Berurah, shortly after the Mishnah Berurah was finished. So he didn't see it, and there it said clearly that for rain b'chlal. And he says anyway, even according to the Mishnah Berurah says if you have no other eitzah, but Lamaisa, if you have no other eitzah and you go in and you started off the heter, then it's okay. He also quotes the Eitzir HaGo'inim to Maseches Megillah Shohaitzi Rabbi Binyamin Menashe Levin. So Binyamin Menashe Levin is a famous chayker. He printed Eitzir HaGo'inim on 12, 13 Masechtas, where the concept was he was malaket all the texts of Go'inim. I think it started off mainly as whatever was quoted in Rishonim, and then maybe at some point it also started including stuff from the Geniza in Cairo, where many new texts from the Go'inim were discovered. So he tried to take whatever texts we have from the Go'inim and be misaded with Yisei Dara Masechta, so you can learn Gemara with the Teres HaGo'inim. It was a very unique and pioneering project. And once he passed away, the project has been on hold. In the last 10 years, they started printing. There were a few attempts to print on one Masechta and another Masechta, but still at a much slower glacial pace. I was actually surprised to find out recently that Rabbi Binyamin Menashe Levin actually has Lubavitch descendants. One of his daughters, I believe, married Lubavitcher, and it's a Lubavitcher family. Yes, people know Lubavitch is named after him. I also just, while I was looking into this, I saw that he actually came from a Lubavitcher family in Russia. So interesting connection I wasn't previously aware of. So Rabbi Binyamin Menashe Levin quotes that there's a Rav Hai Goyen, a very interesting thing Rav Hai Goyen says. Rav Hai Goyen says, and this is a question you also see mentioned a lot in the last 100 years in Shabbos. If you're teaching children in a shul and you finish the Limudei Kodesh, can you learn Limudei Chayil with them in the same space? So the Rav Hai Goyen already asked this question, and he said that you could learn Ksav Arvi, you could learn Arabic script. That was the Limudei Chayil, and Haigain already was in Bavel, once it was already a Muslim country. So they're allowed to learn Arabic and math, but it has to be the Hemshech the Torah, not as just a standalone class where you come to shul to study Limudei Chayil. And what about Tinoikus Shel Goyim? Because if you're already teaching secular studies, then Goyish kids are also interested. So he says, if you're able to be doicha them, try to do that. But if it's going to cause anger, so then, Darkei Shalom. This is also quoted in Sefer Itim, Rabbi Yehuda Barceloni, one of the Rishonim. And he says, he says that there's a beer, Itim Labina, on the Sefer Itim. I wanted to say that it's a Tzorech Mitzvah, father is Mechuyev Lamdei Umnes, you have to teach your child a trade. This is Mechilas Kvei Terasai. Then, according to that, then it should be mutter without learning Limudei Kodesh. You're saying that it's mamash a mitzvah. But karchach is not a tzorech mitzvah, because sitting and learning the umnes is not a mitzvah. There's a general chiyah for the father to give his child, teach his child a trade. But to say that when they're sitting and learning how to, be a smith or whatever, that's not how to be a shoemaker. That's not dvar mitzvah every second that you're doing that. And it's only mutter if the thing you're doing itself is a mitzvah. Because according to the Itim Labina, so then any job, any trade, any class should be allowed in the shul without any special reason. And that kind of davar is ef shelo imre, impossible to say that. So by karchach, it's like Rabbi Goyen said that it's behemshech to the limud HaTorah, and it's like the concept of saying a pasuk in order to get started.
Rabbi Goyen was talking about it tonight or not tonight?
No, we've been not talking about it tonight since the first section. We spoke about it tonight there. We've been talking about Hatayr Mechlaf, Mechazal, Tzarech Rabim, Hesper, this, that. So the Gemara says you're allowed to walk in to say a pasuk. We're just trying to determine how far we can apply that. And from Rabbi Goyen, it seems like we can apply that even to Limudei Kodesh and Limudei Chayil. He says, I saw the Netziv, there's the Shiltis, and the Netziv has his Hamik She'ela on the Shiltis. This is already going off. He made his point. But just one last thing he says about the whole question of a Sudas Mitzvah. He says the Netziv wants to be Deicha, that maybe even a Sudas Mitzvah is not allowed, because you can't compare a Sudas Mitzvah to the Ibur. The Ibur is its own thing. Because weiter, from this logic, because you're going into the show to be ma'aber the year anyway, so you started off doing something like that, and then you have a suda, that's one thing. But to just come and have even a suda's mitzvah, then it's was trying to be deicha. But even though he himself seemed to suggest otherwise earlier, but now the suda H is deicha, then it says no, fakert. The Seudas Ibor is considered a mitzvah in its own right. And that's the pshat, that any Seudas mitzvah is allowed, unlike what the Netziv says. It says in Yushalmi Sanhedrin that Rabbi Yochanan went into the Knishta in Tzafra, which I believe would be Tzipari, and he was gathering the crumbs and he was eating. And he said, Yehei Chalki Iman de Kadosh Yarcha. I want to have something to do, a connection. I want to feel part of those who were Makadosh the month. Apparently he was not involved, but the way he was able to express his involvement was by having the crumbs that they left over. He says, as Yudayesh throws in a line, he says, V'kayadua shal zeh seimchim hachasidim she'oichlem shirayim b'seudas Rabbi Seyam. It comes from this Yerushalmi that the Yochanan was eating the shirayim from the Su'udah of the kid, the Ibra Hashan or Ibra Chedesh, and that's how we felt a part of it, so that's the Makar and Halacha for shirayim. So it's not what the Netziv wanted to say, but again, the gather of Sudas Mitzvah. And again, we have the Raya from Shabbos. Mar Psachim talks about making Kiddush and Shul on Shabbos, and they say it's because it's a Sudas Mitzvah. And the Magen Avraham, he says, my contrast, where I'm more barichas than this, weiter, the Magen Avraham wanted to say, only Ibr Shana, where there's no Kalas Rosh, and they're only eating Pas and Kitnius, which is based on the Gemara in Bavli and Sanhedrin, but forget about Ibr Shana. Look at the Suda Shabbos, Suda's Mitzvah, is Basar V'Dagim. And he says from Yishalmi Brachas, it's mashma. They also ate grapes. I didn't have a chance to look it up. Sounds intriguing. It says Valpiza, and here he's winding down this part of the discussion. It's Valpiza and all the eastern countries. It's already been established. But of course, you can eat a Sudas mitzvah in shul, Siyam Hashas, Shalosh Shudas. And he seems to be saying that it's not Mishum Tanai. It's Pashut Mitzvah Dinah de Gemara, that a Sudas mitzvah is always allowed in shul. You need a Tanai, that the whole discussion comes for other Achilush there. But this is Mamish Mutter from the Gemara. And even though the Prima Gadim wanted Aser, but there's who to rely on. And Vaiter, the Magen Avram, the Prima Gadim didn't see all of these Rishayim who are Zerua, the Manik, the Pardas, who brought this raya from the Gemara Pesachim about making Kiddush and said that it's a Sudas mitzvah. And then getting back to what we were discussing here, he says, I already heard that already in the eastern countries they started already being matir, taka, to have speeches in shul. And trustworthy people told me that even in Tel Aviv they have gatherings and speeches in shul. I don't know what the big chach is, but I guess in Germany that made a reishim that even in Tel Aviv they're doing it.
Tel Aviv was just from a Platz.
I guess to some extent. So that's where he draws that. That's where that part of the discussion draws to a close. Now the question of concerts. So this really leads us back to what we discussed last week. He says, all my arguments that I made should apply for concert as well. It's tzarcherabim, v'chulu, he says. However, you have the whole issue of what's the whole gather of music nowadays. In Tafkov Samach, near the Hilchos Tainus, right? You're not supposed to be menagem b'klei Shiur after the Churban. But kvar nogu to say divrei tishpachos or shushul haydois v'zikar nechasei kadosh baruch hu al hayayin, and the Ramah says it's a mitzvah chas mikala. But otherwise, Stamazoi, it's not allowed, and it's Isser also for the person listening, like it says in Saita, the ear who listens should be punished. So Bazoi, Bavadai, there should be an Isser to make Stama concert in the shul. As we shall see, he's talking about concerts of secular Tam songs. In Ashkenaz, people are going, even very from people go to secular concerts anyway. You know, a secular concert in Germany at that time was probably classical music. So, stuff like that. So even from a Yidden in Germany, we're matter to go to that at a concert hall. So it could be they're being samech on the shita that says fakir. It's only usher in a mishta or someone who has it. Like last week we quoted barichas from Yehuda Arya of Modena that made this argument that it's dafka in those contexts the Gemara mentions a mishta or the Reish Galusa that had entertainment at home. But if it's not that, even if it's the middle area, the gray area, there's a shita that says that's okay. So the Yereim and Ashkenaz going to concerts must be relying on that. However, the mainstream position of Paiskim still is to Aser, and it's still kind of like that now. Even though nowadays, as we'll see, it's a different issue because the songs have Jewish teichen. But the way he phrases it is that Ba'atzim inside the Paiskim, just music, it might not really be okay. We're just not being meicha against it because no one's going to listen, so that's why we're leaving them alone. But it's really usher outside the shul, so it should for sure be usher inside the shul. Shaila is only if you're allowed to make religious concerts where they're singing psukim. It's all psukim and tefillas. That lachera should be mutter mitzad din. So then is it mutter in a shul? And that's really the question we generally have today. I mean, it depends. A Beis Chabad might be bringing someone in to sing. Also I don't know, Broadway or just general music. So that would make the problem a little more problematic. But or it's just Jewish themed. In which case that's the following question, because you have Magen Avram. Magen Avram quotes the Maril that says that when they sing, or you're sitting at a mishta at a party and they start singing Oidcha Ki Ani Sani, which apparently was a very common zemer, and it's just you're really singing it just for the fun of it. Elamai, you're singing a song with Jewish words. So the Torah is Chagera Sak. The Torah is wearing sackcloth and saying, "You're turning me into a song. You're turning me into entertainment," which is a Gemara. According to Maril, cited by the Magen Avram, it's only mutter in shul when you're saying the pasuk taka for the right reasons to add some music to that. So mashma that this is taking a very stringent, strict position. that even shaloi b'shas mishta, it's awesome. It's bichlal, it's what is this? That would be a mishta. Or mishta could be bad, or mishta could be good. Mishta stamazai would be worse. Here he means a mishta that's hasan lekal or something like that. So if it's in that case, then it would be mutter. But shalei b'shas mishta would be aser, like we said, klishir b'chlal or aser. So mitzad the psukim, you're not supposed to be singing psukim. Mitzad the music, you're not supposed to be playing music. It's not a good thing that you're singing psukim. That makes the music mutter. It's a bad thing. So the music is for sure not good. But then he says, "Mikol makim kvarnogul lahakol b'zeh." The idea that we have the concept of Jewish music and that we sing it is sort of as entertainment, to have a cheery mood. It's already been accepted that it's okay. And he says the big marker for this is the Sefer Shemen HaMishcha and Hilchas Tainus. Who is the Shemen HaMishcha? The Shemen HaMishcha is Reb Shmuel Chaim from Turkey. He lived from the year 1760 to the year 1842. Shemen HaMishcha is Lefi Seder HaRambam, but one of these types of Svarim that's not really commentary on the Rambam. It's halacha sefer. It's often just a halacha sefer that happens to be shtanzach on the Rambam. So I have it here. It's interesting that this is considered to be the makar. He says that it was in the year Tovkuf Ayin, which is 1810. It was a Sudas Mitzvah, Bris Milah, and a Shliach Tzibur started singing Eitcha Ki Ani Sani. It's still from the Ma'aril to the Shemen HaMishcha, it's always Eitcha Ki Ani Sani. And a Talmud Chacham there said, stop, and he didn't let him sing. He made a scene. And I said, let him sing. The Magen Avraham, the Ma'aril, yeah. Anias Daiti, first of all, we're in a basic Knesses. So, plus we're in a shul, that itself could be, here it's a bris milah, there's no question you can have a bris milah in a shul. So it's clearly a more religious type of gathering. So singing a pasuk in that type of context seems like you're singing it for the right reason, not for the wrong reason. Anias Daiti, B'chlal, I don't think this very stringent, Shemen HaMishcha says, this understanding of the Ma'aril, I don't think it's the correct way of looking at it. Look in the Ref, he quotes a goyin that says that Hani Mili Naginas Shal Avas Adam HaChaveirei. The whole issue with Chalal music was love songs, which has always been the dominant form of music, the dominant thing that music is used for. But Divrei Shiras V'Tishpachas, already the Rif brings B'Shem a goyin that no one avoids that. That's always been okay. And that's sung in Batei Chasanim. So even though it's sort of in the gray area, are you really singing it for Hashem, or are you singing it for the music and the entertainment and the excitement and the simcha? But that was what it said, Legabe, the whole Isser B'chal of music. And others quote this as well from the Rabbi Goyen, that Dafka Nigina Shel Avos Adam LaChaveirei, etc. You're praising someone as great, but if it's praising Hashem, then Beis Chasanim, Beis Mishtoyes, whenever there's a happy occasion, the minig is you can sing those things. That it's also in Gittin, where the Gemara has that Zimra is Aser, he says, Hashem the Goenim, only a Shir Shel Cheshek, things like that, inappropriate, but Stam singing to Hashem is a legitimate form of expression. So that should be okay. What about the other Gemara in Sanhedrin about taking the pasuk from Shir Hashirim and turning it into a song? So he says, Weiter. It's by taking the pasuk out of its context and turning it into something more inappropriate. Like the psukim in Shir Hashirim. Psukim in Shir Hashirim, if you read them kipshutam, it's like any other love song, lahavdil. And if you pluck those psukim out and you sing it the way someone sings, regular popular music, so that's the thing the Gemara is complaining about, that you're degrading and disrespecting the psukim and Shir Hashirim and things like that. And that's why it mentions Shir Hashirim, because that would be the most typical one you would do it to. but any other way, if you're taking the pasuk out of its context and you're turning it into a joke. So that would be the problem. But if it's clear that you're Batsum singing the pasuk Kipshuta Elamai, it's in order to cheer everyone up, that should be that should be okay. Quotes other Svarim that hold this as well. But that's essentially the thrust of the Shaman HaMishcha's argument. And the Shaman HaMishcha, interestingly, became everyone references the Shaman HaMishcha as having forcefully made this argument. So, for example, so he quotes the Sudeish himself is Mitzayin to the Stei Chamed. The Stei Chamed cites the Shaman HaMishcha. Look in the Tzitz Eliezer, who passed away pretty recently. The Tzitz Eliezer has a shayla. What's up with singing all these songs, all the popular Jewish music with all these psukim? And he focuses on this Gemara, and he essentially says that look at the Shaman HaMishcha. The Shaman HaMishcha is the one in the Shaman HaMishcha is Stei Chamed. He also mentions that the Ben Ish Chai and the Ben Yoyada says that another inappropriate way, the way he explains what would be inappropriate, is that there's a pasuk about Avram Avinu, and there's a person in the crowd whose name is Avram. So you start singing the pasuk about Avram to this guy. So that's the kind of thing that would be Kamin Zemer. So Akopanim, the way the Shaman HaMishcha paskin and the way everyone seems to have agreed is that even if it's in that gray area where you're singing it not dafka mamish, you're not davening and singing a pasuk and davening, you're just entertaining yourself with psukim, but still, as long as it's being done in a sincere way, it should be okay. But it is worth mentioning that if you see this halachic background, you do have to be careful not to, sometimes some Jewish popular music veers almost into turning the words into a joke, the way they repeat certain words, certain syllables. It sounds like you're making a shtickle atzanas out of it. Or sometimes someone's in the crowd and you say according to the Ben Yoyada, pulling a pasuk out and saying it to that person could be exactly what the Gemara is talking about is not okay. So you still have to be careful even with the heter of singing psukim. So if we're going to have Jewish music in the shul, so what would be the problem? But he says, I'm afraid of the Chassam Sofer, because we already cited last week, the Chassam Sofer said that all our Zaydis, they never brought music into davening, and so he wanted a taina that in davening is not okay, and with Klei Shiur, without Klei Shiur, in the shul, out of the shul, it sounds like Imamish, the Chassam Sofer took a very extreme position. Obviously the context was fighting back against the organ, but Lamaisa, that Chassam Sofer took a very extreme position. So even though the Chassam Sofer, we clearly not listening to the Chassam Sofer when we sing Psukim Stamazoi, we just established that we are matter to sing Psukim Stamazoi, and the Chassam Sofer seemingly wouldn't agree to that. However, he says, Seif Kol Seif, the Chassam Sofer is a very chashuv paisik, and for that reason, I don't feel comfortable being matir in a shul. I don't want to go on the record saying that we can bring that, even though we're being matir outside of a shul, and the Chassam Sofer would not be matir that, but I still don't want to go against the Chassam Sofer in the shul. He says, Misha Keicha Yafa Yeser Mimeni Yava V'Yater. Someone who feels that the breiter plates they can be matir. I believe that, I don't know if anyone officially has gone on the record saying that, but I guess, because he himself really made the case that it should be fine, it's just a Chassam Sofer, and we don't really hold it a Chassam Sofer, so that might be the basis, for going ahead with it. And he just ends off by saying that even if I'm not going to go ahead and be matir it, but Lav Dafka, or let's say the Rav isn't the one organizing it, let's say the community is organizing it, Lav Dafka, the Rav has to go to bat and fight every single thing his community does. But this is not the organ in the shul. That would be Chukas HaGoyim, or Shabbos. That's not the issue here. And another issue you have in Hilchos Shabbos, it says that building a shul on Shabbos, b'kablanos, so technically it should be allowed, because it's b'kablanos, they do the job at their pace, but the Magen Avraham says it's a chil Hashem, because the Christians themselves wouldn't do that on their holidays. They wouldn't allow their work to be conducted in that way, so it would be a chil Hashem if we allowed our basic knesset to be built on Shabbos b'kablanos. So that would be another problem, potentially, but this is not a chil Hashem, because they also have religious concerts in their Batei Tiflasim. So in this case, we're not looking worse the way we're treating our places of worship. the Yedua, and he throws in that in Prague, you had the Kabbalah Shabbos with music, and the Dovid Habris, that whole Chivaris, and the Tshuva, the B'lav L'Hoyle we went through last week. And he says, the Steichemet says that the Svardim make the Tiglachas, what we call the Upshur, and they call it other things, Zihara, Chalaka. They do it in the show with music, specifically with music though, so that's relevant to that. So Rebbe in this case, is this the kind of thing that a Rav has to fight? Avdafka, and he cites the Tshuva, the Ksav Sefer also, Chuppah, one of these Chuppah Tshuvas, and the whole Tshuva, part of the Tshuva is about, does the Rav B'chal have to fight this? Even if you hold it's not okay, you're very frum, but and he said, Lav Dafka, and this ties into, we had a shir on Teichacha. We had 2 shirim on Teichacha. So this idea that if it's just going to turn the people off and create animosity, Lav Dafka, so that comes up in the Ksav Sefer and the Sri Deish over here. Although you can be mechalik between an individual versus the Rav should be taking responsibility for everything taking place. But still, not every opportunity, interesting situation is the same. A Rav doesn't have to necessarily fight every single battle. So, like I said, he didn't want to go all out and be matir, but l'chayda, he really left the groundwork to be matir. He just didn't want to put his name on it. So then now we're at the conclusion of his tshuva. So in conclusion, he says that, in summary, speeches is mutter mitzad din, but better if you start off with divrei Torah, like he wrote. Obviously, the person speaking has to be Yerei Shamayim, not someone who's fry, because if it's going to be a situation where the person is saying divrei minos, that would be pretty terrible. And Bechlal has to be with the Rosh, the Mar Asana. And there can't be debates afterwards, because first of all, who knows who's there? It could be someone who's not religious. We'll start debating the religious person on stage, and you'll have the things being said might not be the kinds of things you want to hear in a show. And also this Kalos Rosh, when you turn the stage into a place for debate. He says debates are often, you're being cynical and sarcastic and akitzois and leitzanos and their laugh lines, and that's already going too far. So presumably a presentation which Milchatchila has those kinds of characteristics, comedy or things like that, maybe Taka would hold that's kalos roish, that you shouldn't be getting into that type of mood in a show at all. Secular concerts is usher b'chol ofen, because me'ikar adin, it's not really mutter, as he said, and the Rav should be meiser nefesh on that, not to be matter, even if he loses his parnasa. That's what he says. A religious concert, but if there's a machlekes, there's room to be matter. But of course, you have to avoid taroivus, which is another shir we gave, mechitzas, and all of that. Now in Germany, now will again be Nizar and Kedusha Beis HaKnesses. However, back in the Hakdama, he said that this does have relevance to nowadays, to other situations and other places where that's the way to gather the community. So we're basically finished here. I just want to add a little bit of conclusion that this, beyond what we already mentioned, this connects to some of the other shiurim that we've already discussed, the shiur on Estan Zoyna and taking money from Machal Shabbos. As I mentioned, that Rav Sternbuch and Shuvas Van Haggis wrote that L'daiti, even if you ask her taking for a shul, but that's on the shul as Kedusha Gemura, but the Batik Nesiyas Shalona that are al Tanai. So he seems to be applying his way of learning the Tanai is that the shul Milchatchila isn't a full-fledged shul, it doesn't have the full-fledged Kedusha, which might be, Lav Dafka is such a glata svara. It seems like a very original way of using that svara to say that the money for the shul can be different. But that's how he used the svara of al-Tanai in that way. Also in the shir regarding Tefillah B'tzibur, so we discussed how there's a sheet of the Ma'aril that there's no Chiv Tefillah B'tzibur, now the different Nehemiah uses that, the Gabi Avelos. And I mentioned that the Rebbe Rashab cites the Ma'aril in different Nehemiah in his shayla about turning a Cheder Sheni into an Ezras Nashim for his mother, the Rebbetzin who couldn't go up to the top floor. So the way he starts off the tshuva though is, when it comes to a shul, there's a big arichos and paiskim, and there's different gedorim, there's a Beis HaKnesses Shel Kfar, Beis HaKnesses Shel Krach. Das Yachid, etc. Ubechol Zenira, the Rebbe Rashab says, She'ene Pashot Shetnai Moil. It's not so clear how and what Tanai would be good for. So that was, he mentioned the Tanai. And then later, I mentioned it then also, he says that Ba'atzem, the Rebbe Marash, who made the shul, made a Tanai that he could use it for whatever he wants. We don't remember what the Lashon of the Rebbe Marash was, but surely he said it in the best kind of way. And by the marriage of the Razah, they made the Suda there with the music, which is also relevant to the music question. And he said that it's because he made a Tanai. But Dayan Sarachiyam, because Batiknis, even if you say Batiknis Shiyas Shabaval, Tanai Asuyas, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You still have a lot of chumras. Just very specific things are allowed without Tanai. So, and that's just Bekitzer, you look at that Shiloh, that Rasham, Barichas, Lahar, that case is different in two ways. On the one hand, the Mamish wanted to demote the Cheder Sheni to an Esres Nashim, which it's his own discussion what the Kedusha of Esres Nashim is, but they wanted to demote it, so that's more severe than just holding an event. And Meidach Gisa, L'Cheder was Mamish of a Yachid. Mamish belongs to a private individual, and not L'Cheder has different din. Even though Rashab was debating how far that applies. You also look in the Tshuva of Reb Zalman Naimark to the Rebbe Rashab, which I also mentioned then, which was printed in one of the Kaivitzim in the last year or two. So he didn't touch on the Maril, but he touched on the Tanai thing. That was the Iker, what he focused on. And he seemed to take a more expansive view of the power of the Tanai, Ayin Sham. And if I'm already mentioning the connection to that Shir and to the Maril, so I can also mention there's a connection to the Parsha of Yisrael, because as I mentioned then, how did I come across this Maril Chatchile? It was in the back of Teira Shleim of Menachem Kasher. He has Miluim in the back of the volumes of Shmois and in the beginning of Vayikra. And in the Miluim of Yisroi, he has an article, Tefillah B'Beis HaKnesses. Why? Because it's the pasuk V'Yidat Olem Es HaDerech Yelchu Ba, and in Targum Yeres and Ben Uziel it says Tohei Delohen Yas Tzleisa De Yatzlon B'Beis Knishtohen. So Parshas Yisroi is in a sense a mucker for the proper davening in the shul, and that's how we ended up in that whole discussion. So there's a nice connection to the parsha. On this specific subject, this specific question, speeches, concerts, I didn't really find that much has been added to the discussion since the Sri Diyesh. When it comes to the shul in general, like I've already said, even though he's a lot more cagey about the Tanai and what you could do with the Tanai and the Taz versus the Magen Avram, I think overall it's more widespread than just accept that the Tanai works and Sudas are allowed. Well, like I said, the Kalas Reish, you can never cross a certain line and you have to be careful with that. From more recent years, what I found was an article called Pilut Tarbutit Beichal Beit HaKnesset, Cultural Activity in the Shul, by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Glicksberg, who's now in South Africa. So he has a sefer Shalas Tshuvas Nitzanei Eretz, so in Chelik Beis, Simon Beis, he has a skamis from Zalman Chemia, another rabbanim like that. So he has the shaila: can you have an orchestra? Can you have a magician to put on a show? And can you hold board meetings in a show? So first, he's ma'idach if you're interested in this topic of shows and the Tanai. So he has a whole arichas about the Kedushas Beis HaKnesses, an arichas about the Tanai, and then when he gets to the concert discussion, he basically cites the Sri Diyesh. One makar he adds is also from very recent contemporary, Rabbi Leo Schlesinger, who's a rabbi in Gilo, has a Shas Shuvas Sherlin B'Darshan. So he has a shaila there about Chazonis concerts, which is another fad, another popular thing to do. And Rabbi Schlesinger takes a pretty negative take on it, that it's really just entertainment, and with the clapping, and the this, and the that, and the Chazanim are channeling Broadway, or whatever it is, and it's not appropriate in a shul. Obviously, he's just talking about in Stama from a shul and from community. However, Rabbi Glicksberg himself points out the Sri Diyesh is implying that sometimes you have more sensitive issues where the community is needs this is the one space essentially where the community can really come together. You're trying to be makar of people, so that could be a mitigating factor. Here, Rabbi Glicksberg is the one who adds that you should cover the Aron with 2 kisuyim if you're holding these types of events in the shul, and he emphasizes though that this is not do whatever you want in shul card. Go, you covered the Aron. It's fakir. It's just for the cover of the Sefer Torah, but it does not take away from the kedusha of the shul at that moment. He cites the Yechav Das. Rabbi Yosef says this clearly that you can't smoke in shul. That was the question. Oh, cover the Aron, and now you can sit and smoke. Which is his own question about smoking in shul. And also last week, I quoted the Igros Moshe to my grandfather, so he was talking there about the mixed dancing and the parties that were done in the shul, and talks about how the Tnai wouldn't help, because Kalas Reish Mamish, Kalas Reish Teheter Lemahani Tnai, so for sure Kalas Reish of Israel Lemahani Tnai, and he adds, Mashem Etzian Misham, as Aron HaKodesh, any klum, he wielded the Aron out, doesn't change anything. So that's another factor to keep in mind, the Aron. And then Rabbi Glicksberg talks about the magician, although in that case he's not even talking about doing it in the shul, because what would be the basis for that? He's talking about having it in the shul's hall, and it's just a question of magic and halacha, which is its own question. Are there ways that it's mutter to do or not? And then when it comes to the question of board meetings, so that's really pretty explicit. Cheshbonus shel mitzvah, that seems to be a form of that should be okay. From the Rebbe, there are some sharp letters regarding people who tried to prevent girls from having events take place in the space inside a shul. So that would be like a kinus for children, or Mesiba Shabbos. The Rebbe, in a letter regarding kaitana, some kind of camp, says that there's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe to a shul that refused to allow Mesiba Shabbos. Very sharp, and the Rebbe in his letters is also very sharp. Now, these types of things, lav dafka, it's all purely Torah. Sometimes you have an event for children. There's also, some entertainment, some this, some that. And yet the Rebbe is taking a very strong position. In those cases, it's not clear whether it was, always coming from Frumkeit or it's just coming from Balabatishkeit. Didn't want to have, just children running around in shul. But either way, there's this sharp response to that. If you're essentially preventing these things from happening because you're not providing that space. The Rebbe himself, there were kinusim for children, and I don't know how far they went with the entertainment when the Rebbe was there. Probably not too much, but there was music. I don't know if they had professional singing in the shul. Maybe it was just Rabbi Hecht singing on the mic. But there was some additional activity going on with the children in the shul. But it would still seem to be the case that if you have a camp for kids, but half a day it's mamish things that have nothing to do with Yiddishkeit, so it would probably be preferable, if possible, to take it out of the shul. It's sometimes you see shuls where it's the opposite extreme. They're not really treating the shul with respect, and you have all the kids stuff strewn all about. However, again, if that's ultimately the only way to carve them is this is the only space, etc., presumably that would mean that it's probably okay. Lahar b'chlal, that we also, we hold Farbrengens in shul, and Farbrengens have singing and have music, and it's an example of something that's not necessarily a Sudas mitzvah mamish, but it also has that benefit for those who participate. So Lamaisa, and like really in every subject, if you have a shaila, it's Negei Lamaisa. Once you're aware of all the issues involved, so of course you must always consult with a Rav.